Amanda Tyler joins me now, and I am a big fan. Once I saw your testimony last week go viral, I went down the deep dive. I've now listened to your podcast and seen your work. Now, of course, read your whole bio because I'm going to interview you. And I'm really excited to have you on the show, and congratulations on all of your really important work, and thank you for doing it.
Oh, thanks so much, and thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, let's first of all, I learned something just now that I had not heard anywhere, so I want to get right to it. In Texas, they just passed a law to have chaplains in the school and replacing kind of traditional support people of some sort. Can you tell me what is going on in the state that apparently you just recently moved back to?
I know. That's the reaction I get from a lot of people. Wow, you are really headed right to the center of Christian nationalism. Yeah. No, it's true, and it's a return home for me and for my family. I'm a native Texan, grew up in Austin. My husband's from Dallas, and so we are living in Dallas. And last legislative session, last spring, the Texas legislature passed a first of its kind law that does encourage school boards.
I think I lost you for a second there, Amanda. You there?
Oh, I'm here. Yeah. Can you hear me? No, you can't hear me. Huh. I can hear and see you.
Okay, that was probably going to happen once and then won't happen again. Every once in a while it does right when I start, and I've got it edited and I can pick right back up where you said, but I'm just going to do something real quick on my end, which is it like buffers. I'm going to leave the studio and come right back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Just stay right there. Okay. You got me?
Yes, I can hear and see you.
It will probably be fine now. If that happens again, I would be shocked, but it might. And then I can do one more thing to change. We can just go over to Zoom and I'm sure work fine, but I think we'll be fine. If you just pick up where you said, yes, everybody says that I moved back to Texas. It's a return of sorts, and wherever you want to pick up, I can splice it perfectly.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a common reaction I get. Like, what are you doing moving back to Texas, which is, ground zero in a lot of ways for Christian nationalism. But for me and my family, it's really a return home. I'm from Austin. My husband's from Dallas. We settled in Dallas this summer. And so as you noticed or referenced, last legislative session, the Texas legislature passed a first of its kind law that encourages school boards to replace their school counselors with unlicensed, unregulated school chaplains. Now, really put quotes around the word chaplains, because in the bill itself, it has no definition of what a chaplain is. The only requirement is any person who can pass a school background check. So the reaction I get when I tell people about this law around the country is exactly what yours was, Pete. Like, what are you talking about? This is a horrible idea. And I call it a problem in search of a problem, because it doesn't seem to be solving any identifiable gap in public education, and rather it introduces a host of potential problems into the school boards and school districts.
Yeah, I can imagine. No, you don't know me well enough. My thought is, wow, I can be a Texas chaplain now, I guess.
You could, as long as you can pass a criminal background check. Anyone can.
I can.
And there's nothing in the law that even gives you a job description, right? Like, you could do anything, including, and this is where my organization and I come in, what's really troubling is you can proselytize in public schools. And that's a real infringement on everyone's religious freedom.
Again, I think people need to hear what I have to say. So I am really excited to move to the heat dome that you now live in. It's very troubling. It's very, very troubling when I heard that. And I want to talk a little bit more about it. But when I heard that, you guys talking about that on your very, very good, informative podcast, my immediate reaction, and then it was so great, is why it's a good podcast. You answered my immediate reaction. When I heard these techless chaplains are now, Texas schools with everything you just explained, I was like, I've been around long enough. Who's behind that? Who's doing that? And then you explain who's behind it. And of course, there's a quote shadowy group that wants what? Who are they? And how did they achieve this amazing achievement for them, I would imagine, in Texas schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a group named the National School Chaplains Association, which is a subsidiary of a longer standing group called Mission Generation. And right on this organization's Form 990 that they file with the IRS and that it's available publicly, they state as their reason for being that they are trying to disciple into the faith, which is Christianity in their case, into the faith 100 million school children between pre-K and 12th grade by 2025. So this group has really ambitious goals, and they're going to accomplish it, they say, by using school chaplains. And so they went to the state of Texas. They lobbied for this piece of legislation. Again, not something that families in Texas were clamoring for, but this interest group was. And they convinced the Texas legislature to pass their bill. It is now law, and now they're going to other states. They've introduced a similar piece of legislation in Ohio. We've also heard that they're looking at Florida and Oklahoma, and your state could be next. They're coming for this with this piece of legislation.
Oh, I hope they do. I can't wait to meet them at the school board meetings. It's just always a fun time. Yeah, it's really disturbing because it brings up a million questions as what they're trying to do. It's one thing. My immediate reaction was they're trying to turn people into Christians. They're proselytizing. It's like the Jehovah's Witness came to your door and you let him in and said, "Stay, take over, just teach everybody. You work here now." But then it made me think, well, what if a student goes to talk to one of these people and maybe they are confused about something about their sexuality or something that's happening at home that this person then uses their religious ways and some kind of conversion therapy type stuff. I mean, it brings up a lot of concerns. Maybe just what is yours?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one could think of any number of places where an unlicensed, unregulated school chaplain could be using their office here as a government official. They are in the schools as a government sanctioned position to push their religious faith on vulnerable school children. That is why, I mean, we have constitutional protections against this, by the way, that we have long had these fundamental ideas of separation of church and state that said that public schools should not be pushing religion on anyone. And that's not just to protect people who aren't Christians, that's to protect Christians too, because there are so many different expressions of Christianity. And I, as a parent, should be able to send my son to a public school. He does go to a public school in Texas, without being worried that my choices and my husband's choices for our religious upbringing for our child will be interfered with by someone at the school. Now, I'm very happy to say that the school district that I live in, Dallas Independent School District, brought this policy up for a vote recently and decided not to start a school chaplain
Oh,
program.
good. So it's district by district.
Yes. And so the state of Texas, I think probably unwittingly opened up advocacy opportunities in all 1,200 school districts across the state of Texas.
Unwittingly.
And most of the school districts that have taken this up, the vast majority have voted it down, which one shows you that this is not something that people on the ground want. And also, I think, should be a cautionary tale for these other states. Don't pass a law that this interest group wants you to pass because it's going to be very unpopular with the people in your state.
Oh, wow, wow, wow. And my understanding is you have an interfaith marriage. And so who knows how you're bringing your children up. But the point is, you want it, I guess, to be up to you guys.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a Baptist. My husband is Jewish. And,
Wow.
there's this thing called parental rights in this country that there seem to be some people who like to trumpet that at certain times, but not at others. So in this law, there was an amendment brought up in the Texas legislature to require parental consent to meet with the chaplain. And guess what? The legislators voted it down. So parental consent, I guess, doesn't count when you're trying to proselytize to kids in public schools. But in other areas, they're sometimes the first ones to
Well,
talk about parental consent.
yeah, it is such that caught fire quick, that idea. Parental rights, parental consent. We heard it at all the meetings, the board meetings, and it just drives me crazy, Amanda, because these are, this is cheap of me to say, but these are often the same people that don't even make a parent-teacher conference. They're not involved in the schools at all. They just heard something was happening and they showed up and started screaming. And it's like, you have all the parental rights. We have amazing parental rights. I emailed the superintendent, the principal, the assistant principal, the counselor, the teacher. You know who gets back to me faster than anybody I ever talked to? The people who are working at school. We have a lot of parental rights. It's just such a made-up thing from people who have no idea about how much access they have to their public schools. That is the end of my rant, but it does help me pivot into just the idea of language and kind of branding and what gets into our American cultural, political, media lexicon. And I think that it's important that we continue to talk about Christian nationalism. And I've been talking about it for a very long time. Your work on it has been so influential. You just testified in front of Congress last week when Mike Johnson became speaker, actually, I think earlier than last week. But the point I'm trying to make is that this was not part of the conversation, and it's starting to become a part of it. But I want to understand where you think we are on this idea, which is so dangerous.
Yeah, well, as you note, Christian nationalism is a very old ideology, but in the last several years, we now have language around what it is, and we see a lot more conversations about it, which I think is so important. If we're going to work to dismantle this political ideology and cultural framework that tries to merge our identities as Americans and Christians, then we have to have language around it. And so the group that I lead, which is a Baptist Joint Committee, we also lead a campaign called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And we put that together over 4 years ago in the summer of 2019, really in response to increasing violence that we were seeing, particularly at houses of worship, and how this ideology of Christian nationalism was being used by white supremacists to try to justify their violence, but also was really a motivating ideology for them to take up arms in the first place and go into houses of worship to kill people. So we started like really focusing in.
I think of Charleston church shooting, of course, and I think of the synagogue in Pittsburgh.
Right.
I'm not sure how influenced they were by the ideology. I know they were white supremacists.
They both were, both the shooters in Mother Emanuel AME Church and at Tree of Life Synagogue. We also saw the ideology being used by the extremist groups who gathered in Charlottesville at the Unite the Right rally, and some of their demonstrations were purposefully done around synagogues as well. So we see this overlap with anti-Semitism in particular, also Islamophobia, anything that would other any group other than the Christians that they define as their in-group. But I do think that we saw a lot more attention being paid to Christian nationalism after the insurrection on January 6th, because of the presence of that ideology, both on January 6th itself, but also in all of those rallies leading up to the insurrection, and how that really worked to unite all these different groups with a common language and imagery, again, to try to justify their violence.
For sure. But what I heard on your podcast was that wasn't really centered at the January 6th committee hearings, which were otherwise pretty well received, lauded, or, across the spectrum, obviously not on the far right and on Earth too, but that they did a good job at that. But when I was listening to your podcast, then I talked to Andrew Seidel and others. I think Robbie Jones were part of that paper. Your organization and theirs worked together to look at the Christian nationalist influence in the insurrection. And yet the point I'm trying to make is it doesn't seem like Congress did.
They really didn't, although it was very disappointing to us because, as you referenced, BJC and Freedom from Religion Foundation co-produced this report on Christian nationalism in January 6th. We made it available, of course, publicly, but also to Congress. And at that point, the Select Committee actually invited our testimony, our expert testimony, written testimony to the committee. And so we all submitted written testimony to the committee. And then we were waiting to see either the topic come up in the hearings that were televised, but if not then at least in the large report they issued at the end. And it was nowhere to be found. And, I do think there's a reason for that. I think that for most members of Congress, they still see bringing to light Christian nationalism somehow to be an attack on Christianity, when nothing could be farther from the truth. And so I think it's up to people like me who identify as Christian and who claim this faith as our own to explain to members of Congress and to the public that to be against Christian nationalism is not to be against Christianity. And that's a point I've made in both times that I've testified to Congress on this topic.
What was by the way, just real quick, the reaction when the work that you do in and day out is recognized, kind of really does go viral? You don't strike me as someone who is self-centered, but like the work, you must feel, all of you over there, that must have been a pretty big moment last week with that clip.
It does, because it shows me that what I am saying is striking a chord with so many other people.
Right.
And it's in those moments that I do feel really fortunate to be in the position that I am, because I think that I'm reflecting the viewpoint that so many people have, Christians and others. For Christians, we're tired of seeing our faith used and really twisted in ways and distorted in ways that we can't even recognize it in order to justify exclusion and violence. And for non-Christians, I think they're really pleased to say, finally, someone's standing up and, really saying that this isn't Christian, and they're showing a better way to be Christian in their mind. And so, it really is encouraging that we're not alone in this, and to see the message get out beyond the four walls of those hearing rooms into the broader public.
It reminds me frighteningly and almost hilariously, because when I would talk to so many Muslim scholars, comedians, journalists, over the years, around 9/11, after 9/11, there's always had to be the denunciation and the disclaimer, and then the explanation of the billions of Muslims who are nonviolent and have a different set of beliefs. That's what this is in America now. Like that's what your organization is trying to do. Christians against Christian nationalism, because the Christian nationalism is violent and it's taking people's rights. And my question is, how often do you communicate, and what is most effective? Because I've only just started listening to your podcast, season 5, and so I may have missed it, but I'd love to hear your conversation with the folks that you're trying to explain this to, other Christians who don't understand this. Like, how is it working? What is the most effective way to talk to other Christians and explain to them this threat and what it's doing to them, their communities, their government?
Yeah, well, often we go straight to the Bible, to our holy book, to the example of Jesus, whose central message was this gospel of love, who himself was always on the side of the oppressed, the marginalized, who was never on the side of power, and explain how Christian nationalism distorts this gospel of love into this false idol of power. We talk about idolatry, about how Christian nationalism tries to merge political and religious authority in ways that confuse who we are actually serving and worshiping. I think that language of idolatry really resonates with people in Christian spaces, because we know the Bible. We know the Bible says not to make false idols, that our first commandment is to love God above all else. And then the second one, like it, in the words of Jesus, is to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so how Christian nationalism leads us away from following the central commandments of our faith. I think that people that I talk to in churches, and that's where I'm mostly speaking. I speak in churches. I present this presentation on Christians against Christian nationalism, and that really resonates with people. And sometimes they just are looking for, one, just information about what Christian nationalism is. 2, to have the tools and to really explore through Bible study, kind of what are some of the religious responses to it. And 3, they're just saying, how do I talk to my friends and family about this? And that's where I really urge this other central value of Christianity and other religions too. It's not exclusive to Christianity, and that's having a humble spirit to come at this with a sense of humility, that we are all, you know, because we live in this culture, we are all impacted by Christian nationalism. And sometimes we're going to make right decisions, sometimes we're going to make wrong decisions. And our call as people, but also our call as Christians, is to continue to try to make the right decision. And so there's always a point that we can turn more towards Christianity and turn away from Christian nationalism.
How much, I really don't know how much religious leaders, evangelical leaders are preaching from the pulpit in their churches many of these different ideas. I mean, is it a problem that there's a lot of preachers, religious leaders that sound like Tucker Carlson, that are really fired up about politics, about sexual orientation issues, gender issues, immigrants, race, and so on? Is that because another thing I learned from listening to you guys is that a lot of the people who identify as evangelicals don't actually even go to church. They just it's like they fall into it in a way, which I thought was really surprising. Where does the problem lie? Is it media? Is it in the churches themselves? How bad is that?
Well, I think it's a little bit of all of the above. I mean, I think we have some notable, it's a real minority, I think, but some very loud and notable examples of these pastors, including
Yeah.
pastors in places called patriot churches. There's this whole kind of burgeoning movement of
Yeah.
churches that will
Great.
actually paint an American flag on the roof of their building. I mean,
Oh,
those churches are all in, right? But that's still a distinct minority. I think the bigger problem, not just in evangelical churches, but really in all Christian churches, is not always taking on Christian nationalism enough. Because,
right.
and this is what I've heard from a number of different pastors, is particularly in churches that their congregants might be more conservative politically. They're like, Fox News has them, dozens of hours every week. I
Yeah.
get them 1 hour a week. That it's hard to kind of disciple away from all that they're hearing
Such a good
from.
point. Yeah.
And it's not just Fox Media, but it's all these other alternative media sites now that are really spreading election denialism and all kinds of other falsehoods. So the pastors are put in a difficult position, but sometimes their position is not to try to contradict what they're hearing on the news all week. And that's what we're really trying to do, is to have churches be willing to have hard conversations about Christian nationalism within their churches, try to counteract what they might be hearing about, on in some of these other places about faith and freedom and America's a Christian nation. They're getting that in the culture.
Yeah.
How
Right.
can we in churches really take some of that mythology and that really contradicts our religion? How can we take that on more directly in church?
Well, it would seem we've come to a climax of sorts, because the day that you were testifying about this threat, they elected a Speaker of the House who is a Christian nationalist, I think, by almost every definition, born into it by people like David Barton, who you can tell us about. I mean, his mentors. You shared on your Twitter X Elon Musk Funhouse feed, which you have a great feed, by the way, over there. So I still follow people over there, so you should follow Amanda. But you have this, I think you shared his first, Mike Johnson, new speaker's first fundraising or a early fundraising plea, which is so religious, Christian nationalisty, that it made me nauseous. So how do you describe what I'm referring to, this time period where we are at, when now the Speaker of the House is a guy who, did you hear about the app? The app that he shares, that keeps him accountable so that he doesn't look at pornography? I should have asked you before I hit record to react to that, so you don't have to, but you can watch the clips. They're from a few years old. He and his son kept each other accountable, is my understanding. Again, you don't need to comment on it because you haven't read about it, but you will after this. It's crazy. What does he mean? And how much do you know? And were you familiar with him? What do we need to know? Where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, I think now we have as the highest ranking person in the US House and the third person, right, in line to the presidency is someone who is warmly embracing Christian nationalism and has for a long time. I mean, we can look at his legal career. He was an attorney for this group called Alliance Defending Freedom. He has been consistently attacking the concept of the separation of church and state. And in his very first speech, in accepting his new position, he talked about his beliefs that everyone in the U.S. House had been ordained by God. Again, spreading this idea that to be a member of Congress is to be a religious person as well and to share his religion. I found it deeply troubling because it is so exclusive in nature. And then, as you note, seeing this fundraising appeal was really outrageous. And not only in the way, one, again, he's spreading this misinformation and this mythology of a Christian nation, saying that is so influenced by this pseudo historian David Barton, saying our nation began with the bold declaration that all men are created equal by God and that our rights derive from Him and not from the government. This whole idea that we don't have a separation of church and state, and then saying we can't allow the radical left to destroy the ideals that our country was founded on. So this deeply divisive language and using the language of Christianity to justify it. I've talked about how not only does this betray our First Amendment, our country's commitment to religious freedom for all, but also Speaker Johnson is a Baptist. It betrays the Baptist heritage of standing up for separation of church and state. Many people might not know that, but it was Baptists who petitioned the leaders of Virginia to not have an establishment of religion in Virginia that then was the precursor to the First Amendment protection as well. So I'm deeply concerned at how Christian nationalism is being normalized and how now it seems to be in the speaker's chair as well.
Yeah, yeah, really, really important. I guess the last thing I want to ask you about is something that you know a lot about. You testified, I think, a couple of years ago about specifically about the issue of race and racism and white supremacy and the threat that that poses. I'm proud to have like a really amazing group of diverse ethnically listeners, a lot of Black folks that listen to the show, and I think a lot of them are religious, mostly Christian, and they understand this obviously threat pretty well. I've learned a lot from them. What is it that you are most concerned about? Because I think the other thing to point out, we didn't really touch on this as much because I haven't been getting into the weeds, but your podcast also covers the Supreme Court term. So it's a lot of legal stuff. You guys are lawyers and really fascinating, important stuff that I talk a lot about here. So paying attention to the court, its decisions, and when it comes to race, we pay a lot of attention to that. And that is, I think, one of the most disconcerting threats that Christian nationalism pose, the intersectionality of that with white supremacists. So what do you want to say about that?
Yeah, so we talk about it at the project by saying that Christian nationalism often overlaps with white supremacy and racial subjugation, and so we talk about white Christian nationalism, and basically how the Christian in Christian nationalism is not really about theology as much as it is an ethno-national identity. It's a really coded way to be racist, because we're basically saying Christian nationalism is a whole ideology about who really belongs, and it's basically saying that God ordained the way that the country's set up. So that means that God ordained slavery. That means that God ordained the stealing of land from indigenous peoples and the genocide that followed. It says that God ordained Jim Crow segregation and racial violence. You can't pick and choose
God
if
ordained voting rights achievements and then the removal of those achievements of voting rights. I mean,
right, right. So and
he's
of course people
confused.
will be you will see people get very self-righteous when I say these things, is they're like, you're calling me a racist, I'm just a Christian. And
Mm.
you're like, well, what you're doing is you're using this language to try to cover up some of these racist ideas. And again, just like Christian nationalism is embedded into the culture here, so is racism.
Yeah.
And so every person has a continuing obligation to try to understand how racism is impacting our views and to move away from it, just
Yeah.
like we do with Christian nationalism. So the defensiveness is not helpful in these conversations. Instead, if we can just try to understand how this ideology is permeating and how all of these assumptions are influencing the way that we're responding in our multicultural society today, I think we will be much more successful in making progress into being the multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society that we want to have.
Well, if anybody's going to do it, it's people like you guys and your organization and a lot of the other people I get to talk to here. It's a real honor to get to talk to you. I hope folks will go check out all of your work, especially the podcast, which is imminently listenable. And I learned so much today. I'm really excited and feel fortunate that I then get to call you and talk to you. So that's awesome. Amanda, thank you so much for joining me. I hope we can do it again.
Oh, me too. Thanks so much, Pete.